Chapter 1: A Taste of Rust and Smoke. The metallic taste of blood clung to the back of his throat long before he dared to open his eyes. Not his blood, at least, that's what he kept telling himself. His own blood usually tasted like copper. This tasted like rust scraped from old railroad tracks left to die under desert sun. He blinked. Heat pressed against him like a wet blanket left too long in a boiler room. The air smelled of gasoline, burned sand, and the thin sour hint of something recently dead. Not one something. Many. Too many. The wind whistled through broken metal, making the carcass of the train groan like a wounded animal. The sound was almost human. Almost comforting. Almost. He forced himself to sit up, hands scraping against hot steel. His palms came back stained with a reddish-brown smear. He didn't want to know what part of the train, or who, it belonged to. A vulture landed on the roof above him with a thud heavy enough to shake dust loose. That was when he saw the first body. A man, maybe middle-aged, maybe older, impossible to tell under the dried blood and sun-scorched skin. His throat was slit with such precision it looked like a surgeon had decided to become a poet. The cut was straight, elegant, almost thoughtful. The others were the opposite, messy, hurried, angry. As if their killer grew impatient. 5 bodies in total. 5 passengers on a train no one remembered scheduling, discovered halfway across the desert in the middle of a week that should have been ordinary. Should have. The wind shifted, carrying the stench of rotten oil. He staggered to his feet. He was alone. Or he should have been. Somewhere behind him, metal creaked. Footsteps. Breathing. Or his imagination dragging claws down the inside of his skull again. He spun around. Nothing. Just humming silence and a long stretch of sand shimmering like melted glass. The heat distorted the horizon, making shapes dance, people, maybe, or ghosts. Same thing, really. His shirt clung to his back, soaked in sweat. The fabric smelled of smoke, iron, and fear he hadn't admitted to yet. A fly landed on his neck. He slapped it so hard his ears rang. The train stood motionless, as if the desert had swallowed its wheels. Sunlight glinted off the locomotive's number plate, except there was no number. Someone had scraped it clean. The bodies hadn't been dead for long. He knew that much. Flies don't swarm with such confidence unless the feast is fresh. He took a step toward the nearest corpse, and froze. There were no footprints in the sand. Not his. Not anyone else's. Not even the victims. As if everyone had simply appeared here. Dropped into place by hands that left no shadow. He swallowed hard. Then another thought broke through the buzzing tension in his skull. If no one walked here, then where did the killer go? The air suddenly felt colder, though the sun was unforgiving. He knelt and checked the pockets of the nearest victim. No wallet. No papers. No hint of who he had been. Whoever killed these people had cleaned them as thoroughly as the number plate. The vulture above him croaked impatiently, as if urging him to move faster, as if time itself were annoyed with him. He wiped sweat from his brow, smearing more rust-colored residue across his forehead. He tasted it on his lips. That same metallic flavor of tracks and old secrets. His heartbeat quickened. The desert around him buzzed, like a wire pulled too tight. And then, in that suffocating silence, a question rose, not from the dead, but from someplace deeper, colder. You think the truth always belongs to the victim? He looked at the bodies. At the blank desert. At the empty sky. Maybe not. Maybe truth belonged to whoever survived long enough to tell it. Or to whoever was willing to lie loudest. He exhaled, a thin, shaky breath. Today's story wasn't about victims. Today's story wasn't even about death. No. Today was about the men who disappeared on the very night he was meant to tell the truth buried somewhere inside this sun-bleached graveyard of steel. The men who wasn't supposed to be here at all. The men whose shadow, for a moment, he could swear he saw flicker just beyond the edge of the train. And today, we would finally talk about him. Chapter 2, the question no one wants answered. The sun kept climbing, merciless as a prosecutor who had already decided on the verdict. Heat shimmered above the metal roof of the train, turning the air into a wavering mirage. The bodies lay still, stiffening into grotesque versions of who they once were. Dead people are rarely beautiful, but these 5 looked like death had taken its time choosing the most humiliating poses. He stepped away, trying not to breathe too deeply. The desert had a way of preserving silence, turning every thought into an echo that came back sharper than before. He kept hearing that question. Why do you think truth belongs to the victim? It didn't come from the corpses. They were done talking. It came from memory. Or conscience. Hard to tell the difference these days. He glanced over his shoulder. Still nothing but sand, steel, and vultures. Good. He didn't want witnesses to his thoughts. The world loved victims. They're easier to understand, easier to pity, easier to turn into headlines. But truth? Truth was Messier. Truth belonged to whoever paid the highest price to carry it. He rubbed his temples. The headache behind his eyes pulsed like a second heartbeat. The train groaned again, shifting under the wind. Something inside one of the cars clattered, a loose chain, a broken panel, or something that still had enough life to move. He chose not to investigate. Not yet. Instead, he walked along the length of the train, sand crunching beneath his boots. The locomotive was old, older than it should have been for 1945. The steel was the wrong color. The rivets too large. It looked like a ghost of a machine, something that should have been decommissioned before he was even born. Or something built off the books. He reached the edge of the first carriage. The metal door hung crooked, torn off its hinges. From inside came a faint ticking sound. Not a bomb. Not a clock. A makeshift metronome made from a dangling piece of metal tapping against the wall with each gust of wind. Tick. 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 Just like a question nobody once answered. He closed his eyes and exhaled. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't bandits or soldiers or deserters. Someone had staged a performance in the middle of nowhere, and the audience was supposed to be him. But why? He leaned against the locomotive, its surface hot enough to burn skin. The smell of scorched paint clung to his coat. That was when another question surfaced, uglier, heavier. If truth doesn't belong to the victims, does it belong to the killer? He opened his eyes. Somewhere far, far behind him, heat distortion twisted into the shape of a man. Just for a second. A tall outline, motionless, watching. He blinked. Gone. The desert loved tricking people that way. Or it loved showing them things too true to be real. He wiped sweat off his neck, smearing more dust and blood across his collar. This case, if it could even be called a case, wasn't supposed to exist. The train wasn't on any schedule. The victims weren't in any registry. No one had reported anyone missing. The bodies looked like they had died twice, once violently, and once bureaucratically. He pushed off the locomotive and forced himself to keep moving. He needed answers. But answers required questions. And the most dangerous question was the one he was about to ask. Who was the man who vanished the night this train appeared? Because every rumor, every whisper in the bars, every half-burned police report pointed to one figure. A man with no record. No family. No origin. No grave. A man who had once promised to reveal something that would change the way they looked at the war. And then he simply disappeared. Some said he ran. Some said he died. Some said he was silenced. But the most unsettling theory was the quietest one. He never existed at all. A breeze slid under his coat. Cool, wrong, out of place in the burning heat. As if someone had exhaled near his ear. He froze. No footsteps. No shadow. But the sensation lingered, the feeling of presence, the kind that made your skin crawl and your instincts scream. He turned slowly. Nothing. And yet he felt watched. The worst part wasn't the emptiness of the landscape. The worst part wasn't the dead lying behind him. The worst part was this dawning realization. Someone had been waiting for him here. And he had arrived right on time. Chapter 3, The Man Who Wasn't There. He always hated mirrors. Not because he disliked his own reflection, though God knew he had reasons, but because mirrors had a habit of showing things he never remembered becoming. Back in the years before the war swallowed half the world, He used to be a railroad inspector. A quiet job. Predictable. Tracks, timetables, coffee that tasted like disappointment, and paperwork older than the country they served. He liked that life. He liked routines. He liked knowing that when a train departed, it would eventually arrive, preferably with the same number of passengers it began with. But all that ended the night the telegram arrived. He could still remember the way the paper crumpled in his trembling hand, the ink smudged from the rain that had soaked through the window frame. 2 lines. No explanation. Your wife and son were casualties. We regret to inform you. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply folded the telegram, placed it neatly inside his coat, and walked out the door. For months he drifted through bombed-out cities and burned-out streets, taking small jobs, drinking too much, sleeping too little. His coat smelled of cheap tobacco, sweat, and grief that refused to evaporate. People who met him said he was polite, if distant. People who worked with him said he walked like a man, expecting the ground to vanish beneath his feet at any moment. People who knew him, the few who remained, said he wasn't the same after the telegram. But then again, who was? He rebuilt himself the way you fix a damaged locomotive, change a few parts, tighten a few bolts, pretend the ghost under the metal isn't whispering. And then he returned to the only thing that ever made sense to him. Trains. He became an investigator for the newly reorganized post-war rail division. It wasn't glamorous. He didn't want glamorous. He wanted purpose. A distraction. Something to chase other than memories of a home turned into dust. He wore the same dark coat every day, even when it smelled of smoke. He carried the same notebook, filled with cramped handwriting no one else could decipher. He smoked the same cheap brand of cigarettes, the kind that burned too fast and tasted like regret. Colleagues joked he looked like a ghost haunting the rail yards. He didn't mind. Ghosts didn't have to explain themselves. And that was precisely why, on the night the mysterious train appeared, someone made a point of knocking on his door. It was 2 hours past midnight. He had been sitting alone in his apartment, staring at a wall that had started to resemble a map of all the things he'd lost. The knock was soft, almost apologetic. He didn't get visitors. He didn't want visitors. He opened the door anyway. A young officer stood there, sweating through his uniform despite the cold. His hands shook, and his eyes never settled in one place for more than a heartbeat. "Sir," the officer said. "We need you." It wasn't a request. It wasn't an order. It was something in between, a plea wrapped in fear. He grabbed his coat, his notebook, and the faintest memory of duty. They walked through empty streets, lit only by street lamps still recovering from blackout regulations. The officer spoke in fragments, half sentences, broken details, contradictions. A train. No schedule. Found where no train should be. Bodies. 5. Maybe more. "Why me?" he asked, his voice rough. The officer swallowed. "We were told to find you specifically." "Told by who?" A pause. "That's the strange part, sir." He waited. No one signed the order. He stopped walking. "What do you mean?" "I mean," the officer licked his lips nervously. "The order was typed, stamped, dated, but there's no signature. No department code. No origin." A chill slid down his spine. "You're saying the order came from nowhere?" "Yes, sir." He almost laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. Perfect. Just what he needed. A summons from an invisible hand. He lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating the hard angles of his face. "Fine," he muttered. "Show me." They walked on. He didn't know then that this unseen caller, whoever or whatever issued that unsigned order, would drag him into the darkest corridor of his life. He didn't know that the 5 bodies waiting in the desert would not be the strangest part. He didn't know that somewhere in the shadows, a man who wasn't supposed to exist at all was already watching him. What he knew, as they approached the end of the street, was only this. Sometimes it's not the dead who haunt you. Sometimes it's the ones who vanish. Chapter 4, The Train That Shouldn't Exist. The desert did not forgive mistakes. It didn't forgive much of anything. But on the morning they found the train, it felt almost offended. He arrived just as dawn began to drag its pale light across the sand. The sky was the color of bruised metal, and the ground radiated last night's heat like a dying furnace. The officer who'd escorted him the night before was gone, replaced by 2 policemen who looked as if they had drawn the shortest possible straws. They led him across the dunes in silence. Their boots sank into the sand with dull, resigned thuds. One of them muttered prayers under his breath. The other kept checking the horizon, as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. He couldn't blame them. Even from afar, the sight was wrong. The train stood alone, half buried in the sand, the sun reflecting off its hull like a taunt. 3 carriages. 1 locomotive. A short, compact formation that made no sense for long-distance routes. He approached slowly, his coat flapping behind him. The metal looked old but polished, as if someone had attempted to disguise its age by scrubbing it clean. But not clean enough. He still noticed patches of rust, scars from old repairs, bullet dents that someone had tried to hammer flat. He stopped at the locomotive. That was when he saw it. No number. Not scraped off. Not painted over. Just an empty rectangle of smooth steel where the identity of the train should have been. "Who found it?" he asked. "A patrol unit," one of the officers replied. "Routine sweep. They said the train wasn't here the night before." "And you trust them?" "They were terrified enough, sir." They weren't lying. He sighed. People lied because they wanted something: money, safety, advantage. Terror, however, was pure. He stepped into the first carriage. The heat inside hit him like a punch. The air was thick, stale, trapped. The smell of old blood and hot metal clung to every surface. The 5 bodies were arranged almost ceremonially, though not neatly. It felt less like a ritual and more like a threat left for someone who would understand it. He crouched beside the nearest corpse, a woman with dark hair matted against her face. Her dress was torn at the seams, but not in a struggle. More like someone had searched her pockets and removed something. Her wrists were bruised. Her eyes half open. Her expression frozen mid-panic. He swallowed hard. No weapon. No signs of defensive wounds. No trace of who she was. He wasn't sure which detail disturbed him more, the precision of her death or the effort put into erasing her identity afterward. He checked the next body, a man in a uniform with no insignia. Then another, an elderly gentleman in a suit too expensive for desert travel. All of them had been stripped of anything that could tell him their names. He walked toward the last body, a teenager, barely old enough to shave. The boy's throat was cut, but the rest of him was untouched, as if the killer had hesitated. Or regretted. Or simply didn't need anything from him. He stood. Wiped his hands on his coat. Exhaled a breath he didn't remember holding. One of the officers hovered at the doorway, too scared to enter. "Well?" the man asked. He didn't answer immediately. He scanned the interior again, the broken seats, the dust patterns, the faint smudges on the walls. Someone had cleaned the carriage. Badly. Hastily. "Where is the manifest?" he finally said. "There isn't one." "There has to be." "There isn't." The officer swallowed. According to the station logs, this train was never scheduled. He stared at the men. The words didn't make sense. Trains do not appear out of nowhere. They do not travel without orders or paperwork. They do not materialize in the desert like ghosts with mechanical wheels. "Then who dispatched it?" he asked quietly. "That's the thing, sir." The officer's voice shook. "There is no dispatch. No departure record. No station claim. No route. No railway stamp." He frowned. "That's impossible." "We thought so too." He stepped back outside, shielding his eyes from the brightening sky. The desert wind tugged at his hair, hot and dry, carrying grains of sand that scraped across his skin like tiny blades. He studied the train, its angles, its proportions, its peculiar construction. And then he saw something that made his pulse spike. The couplings between the second and third carriages. They didn't match. Different metal, different era, different engineering. As if the cars came from different trains entirely. As if someone had assembled this whole convoy from scraps. A grotesque patchwork of discontinued models and forgotten parts, a Frankentrain built for one journey only. He stepped closer, tracing his fingertips along the weld lines. Rough. Uneven. Rushed. He muttered under his breath. This thing isn't supposed to exist. Behind him, one of the officers spoke, hesitant. Sir, that's not even the worst part. He turned slowly. There's a rumor, the officer said, voice trembling, that a train exactly like this vanished during the war. Vanished, meaning disappeared without a trace. Some people think it was carrying something important. Classified. Dangerous. And now it's here. Yes. He rubbed his jaw. The sun was fully up now, bathing everything in brutal light. A train with no origin. Constructed from mismatched parts. Appearing in a desert with 5 dead passengers. And absolutely no reason to be here. He looked once more at the empty metal rectangle where the locomotive's number should have been. Not scraped off. Not hidden. Simply never assigned. He whispered to himself. This wasn't a train. This was a message. And whoever sent it wanted him to read it. Chapter 5, The Uncooperative Witnesses. The nearby settlement wasn't even a town, more like a stubborn accident of humanity clinging to the edge of the desert. A handful of shacks, a bar pretending to be a bar, and a police outpost that looked like it had been assembled from spare regrets. The people here lived quietly, drank heavily, and lied professionally. He arrived with sand still clinging to his coat and the smell of the dead train clinging to his thoughts. The first person he questioned was a farmer missing 3 teeth and 1 moral principle. The man leaned against a fence that clearly wasn't going to survive the year, chewing on a stalk of something that looked like it used to be wheat. You see any train last night? He asked. The farmer squinted, as if the question personally offended him. Ain't no trains out here. There's one now. Then it got lost. In the middle of the desert. Happens. He exhaled slowly. People like this didn't lie out of malice, just habit. As if truth was something the government taxed. He tried a different angle. 5 dead passengers. The farmer didn't blink. Lot of dead things in the desert. Not usually on trains. You think I watched the horizon all night? I got goats. Goats don't need tending at 3 in the morning. My goats do. He resisted the urge to rub his temples. After 10 more minutes of circular nonsense, he moved on. The bartender was worse. The man was built like a retired boxer who lost his last match to a sack of flour. He polished glasses with the intensity of someone who didn't want to talk. You hear anything unusual? The investigator asked. I hear everything unusual. Folks here don't come for the alcohol. They come to tell me things I'd rather forget. So forget something out loud. The bartender snorted. You're a funny man. I wasn't trying to be. That's why it's funny. He leaned closer. Did you see or hear anything? Lights. Noise. A train. The bartender stopped wiping the glass. His eyes shifted to the far corner of the bar, where dust gathered like unspoken confessions. Some folks, he began, say they saw lights. Not train lights. Wrong color. Wrong shape. What shape? Long. The bartender hesitated. Too long. Like a knife cutting through the darkness. And the sound? Didn't make any. Trains make noise. This one didn't. He felt something cold settle in his gut. What time? Between midnight and whatever comes after midnight when you don't sleep. You're not being very precise. I'm not paid to be precise. He sighed. Anything else? The bartender looked around to make sure no one was listening, though the bar was empty except for a lonely fly doing laps around a half-finished bottle. Then the men whispered. One of the regulars said he saw someone walking near the tracks before dawn. Tall. Wearing dark clothes. Didn't leave footprints. No footprints at all. Sand was untouched. Like the man wasn't really there. A chill crept up his spine. Where is this regular now? The bartender scratched his chin. Funny thing. He's missing. Missing. Didn't come home last night. didn't open his shop. Wife says he left to check a noise and never returned. He felt the desert heat pressing against him from all sides. Every time he opened a door in this case, another one slammed shut. And the police, he asked, don't like to look for people who don't want to be found. Maybe he does want to be found. The bartender shook his head. No one disappears willingly out here. The desert takes what it wants. The police outpost offered even less. The officer on duty looked like he'd been awake for 3 days straight, surviving solely on caffeine and bad decisions. We filed a preliminary incident report, the officer said. That's all. Let me see it. The officer shifted uneasily. Well, about that. What? It's incomplete. How incomplete? As in, it contains 3 sentences. He stared. 3. Yes. Read them to me. The officer cleared his throat. 1. Train discovered at 0600 hours. 2. 5 deceased individuals. 3. Evidence inconclusive. That's the entire report. You asked to hear it. He pinched the bridge of his nose. You're telling me no one documented the scene properly? The officer leaned closer, lowering his voice. Sir. I don't think they wanted us to. Who? Whoever sent that train. His pulse quickened. And who do you think that is? The officer swallowed. We don't know. But we've seen this kind of thing before. He froze. How many times? Twice. Maybe 3. And you didn't report it? To who? The people who pretend nothing happened. The ones who lose paperwork on purpose. Sir, some trains aren't meant to be found. The words hung heavy in the hot air. Then the officer added, barely audible. The conductor, he said something before he disappeared. Disappeared. Vanished. Like the others. What did he say? The officer wet his lips nervously. He said the train wasn't coming from any station on our map. Then from where? The officer stared at him with hollow eyes. From a place that's not supposed to exist. The room went silent. A dry gust rattled the window. He felt the truth shift beneath his feet like unstable ground. Someone was lying. Everyone was lying. And the worst part was, he couldn't tell if they were lying out of fear. Or obedience. Chapter 6, A Desert Full of Shadows. By the time he stepped back into the sun, the sky had turned a faded yellow, as if the heat had burned the color out of it. The wind carried a dry hiss that slithered across the sand like something alive. He pulled his coat tighter around him, even though it was far too hot for coats, because something colder than the desert had begun creeping under his skin. A settlement full of people who claimed they saw nothing. A missing witness who vanished after checking a noise. A conductor who spoke of a place not on any map. Every clue pointed toward a truth that deliberately refused to stay still. He walked away from the outpost, his boots stirring up little spirals of sand. In the distance, the train sat like a stranded corpse, half consumed by the dunes. It looked smaller from here, less threatening, almost pitiful. But he knew better. Objects aren't always what they seem. People even less so. As he crossed the open stretch between the settlement and the tracks, he felt it again. That prickling sensation on the back of his neck. The one that meant someone, somewhere, was watching. He stopped. Turned slowly. Nothing behind him except heat ripples and dry, cracked earth. He wasn't convinced. The desert had the uncanny ability to hide people in plain sight, not because it provided cover, but because it provided too much emptiness. A single figure could stand 100 meters away, perfectly visible, and still blend into the shimmering air like a mirage. He kept walking, resisting the urge to look over his shoulder again. He didn't want to give whoever was watching the satisfaction. But the feeling didn't fade. It grew. Halfway across the dunes, he saw something, just a flicker, on the edge of his vision. A shadow. A figure. Tall. Thin. Standing perfectly still. He snapped his head toward it. Gone. He waited, heartbeat thudding in his ears. Was it a person? A trick of the light? Or something worse, something intentional? The The wind answered with a soft, mocking whistle. He resumed his pace, faster now. He reached the train just as the sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the sand. The carriages loomed over him, silent, empty, waiting. The metal creaked softly, expanding or complaining. Hard to tell. He approached the second carriage and climbed inside. Dust swirled around him, disturbed by his movement. The interior felt colder than it should have been. Not nighttime cold, something deeper, unnatural, the kind of cold that didn't belong in nature. He stepped past the first row of seats. The air pressed in on him like a held breath. Then he saw it. Footprints. Small ones, leading down the aisle. Not from boots. Not from sandals. Bare feet. A child's. He froze. There had been no child among the victims. And even if there had been, these footprints were fresh. Very fresh. He crouched and touched one with his fingertips. Cold. Too cold. He stood slowly, listening. The train was dead silent. But silence can be deceptive. Silence can be a trap. He followed the footprints, step by step. They led toward the far door of the carriage, then stopped abruptly, as if the child had vanished mid-step. He leaned closer. No smudges. No partial prints. Just a perfect end to a perfect trail. Like the child had stepped into thin air. He swallowed hard. "What the hell happened here?" he whispered. The train groaned in response. He retreated from the carriage, emerging into the bright blinding light of the desert. He shielded his eyes and scanned the horizon. Someone was standing there. This time he saw the silhouette clearly, a tall figure, unmoving, halfway between the dunes and the settlement. Watching. Waiting. He stepped forward. "Hey," his voice cracked across the empty air. The figure didn't move. He took another step, hand drifting toward the inside pocket of his coat where he kept a small revolver he never liked using. The figure shifted, just slightly. Then the wind kicked up a swirl of sand, and the silhouette dissolved. He blinked hard. Gone. Again. The desert was starting to feel alive. And it didn't like him. He clutched the revolver tightly, the metal warm against his palm. His heart hammered in his chest. Then he heard something behind him. A soft exhale. Close. Too close. He turned sharply, weapon half raised. Nothing. Not even a footprint in the sand. His pulse pounded in his temples. A headache bloomed behind his eyes. Maybe he hadn't slept enough. Maybe he was dehydrated. Maybe the desert was playing tricks. Or maybe someone was close enough to touch him, and careful enough not to leave a trace. He lowered the revolver slowly. Whatever was going on, this wasn't just a mystery. It was a warning. And the worst part? He had the sickening feeling he was already too late. Because someone had been watching him from the very beginning. Someone patient. Someone silent. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Not yet. Chapter 7, The Men Who Wasn't There. He returned to the outpost with the sun bleeding out behind him, turning the desert into an ocean of rust. The settlement looked different now, not like a cluster of worn shacks and makeshift walls, but like a stage set that knew he'd figured out the wrong part of the play. People watched him from doorways. From under tattered awnings. From behind curtains that snapped in the hot wind. Not openly. Not enough to be confrontational. Just enough to say, "We know something you don't. And we want it to stay that way." He stepped into the canteen again. The ceiling fan still made that pathetic scraping sound, like it was begging someone to put it out of its misery. The bartender glanced up, eyes narrowing, then immediately pretended to wipe a glass that was already spotless. A few men hunched over a table in the corner clammed up the moment he walked in. He wasn't imagining it. He had never been this popular in his entire life. Ironic. He approached the bar. "Water," he said. The bartender slid a bottle toward him without meeting his gaze. He twisted the cap open. The seal cracked. He drank anyway. If they wanted him dead, they'd had easier opportunities. He leaned on the counter. "You ever seen footprints inside that train?" he asked. The bartender stiffened. Footprints. Small ones. Bare feet. A short silence stretched between them. Finally the man muttered, "This is a desert, stranger. People see things." That wasn't an answer. That was an answer. Just not one you like. He took another drink, keeping his eyes on the man's face. "Fine," he murmured. "Then tell me about the tall man who keeps following me around." The bartender froze mid-motion. A tick pulsed in his jaw. "There is no man," he said. "Tall or otherwise." "Funny," he replied, "I could have sworn I saw him. Twice." The bartender slowly set the glass down. His voice dropped to a whisper. Then stopped looking. He left the canteen with more questions than he'd gone in with. Outside, the air felt heavier. Denser. Like the whole world was holding its breath. Ahead of him, the sheriff was leaning against the wooden railing of the small office, smoking. The cigarette glowed faintly in the fading light. When the sheriff saw him, he exhaled a slow plume of smoke that curled upward and vanished. "You keep poking around," the sheriff said, "you're gonna find something that doesn't want finding." He stopped at the bottom of the steps. The boards creaked under his boots. "I thought lawmen were supposed to like the truth," he said. The sheriff laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Truth is fine. Problem is, we don't always like what comes attached to it." The men stared at him. The sheriff flicked ash over the railing. "You know what we found the first time that train appeared out there?" he asked. He shook his head. "Nothing," the sheriff said. "Not a single body. Not a drop of blood. Just an empty train sitting in the sand like it was waiting for someone." "When was that?" The sheriff looked past him into the desert, eyes hardening. "Long before you were born." A chill crawled down his spine. "You're saying the train comes back," he whispered. "I ain't saying anything. I'm telling you what happened." The sheriff crushed the cigarette under his boot. "Train appears. People die. Then, a while later, it appears again." "How long between appearances?" The sheriff shook his head. "It's never the same." "And the killer?" The men didn't have to finish the question. The sheriff answered anyway. "No one's ever seen him." A pause. "Except the dead." That night, sleep didn't come easily. The walls of the small room felt too thin. The mattress too hard. Every sound, settling wood, shifting sand, distant wind, felt amplified, deliberate, like someone was trying to communicate in a language made of creaks and breaths. He lay awake staring at the ceiling. Thinking. 5 bodies on a train. A missing witness. An apparition of a child that shouldn't exist. A tall man who appeared and disappeared like a trick of the light. A sheriff who spoke in riddles. A town that refused to talk. And the train. The train that returned whenever it wanted, bringing death with it. At some point he drifted off, not into real sleep, but the kind of half-conscious fog that doesn't rest you so much as dull your edges. In that fog he heard footsteps outside. Soft. Measured. Stopping right next to his door. His breath caught. A shadow slipped under the narrow crack at the threshold. Long. Thin. Unmistakably human. He sat up, every muscle tight. The doorknob twitched. Just once. Just enough. Then. Silence. He slipped out of bed, feet hitting the cold floor, and approached the door slowly. The shadow was gone. He pressed his ear to the wood. Nothing. He exhaled shakily. Then. A whisper. Right behind him. "I've been waiting." He spun around. Empty room. The air felt colder. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. Maybe he never had been. As he stood there trembling, one thought stabbed through the haze. Whatever followed him wasn't part of the town. Wasn't part of the sheriff's warnings. Wasn't even part of the train. Something else had joined the game. And unlike the others, this one didn't care about being seen. Chapter 8, The Hollow Passenger. He waited until dawn before stepping outside. The desert was strangely quiet, no chatter, no footsteps, not even the usual metallic groan of the settlement waking up. Just the soft rumble of the wind brushing across sand. As if the whole outpost had decided to hold its breath. He walked toward the sheriff's office, but halfway there he stopped. Someone had drawn something in the sand overnight. Not words. Not symbols. Footprints. Bare. Small. The same size as the ones inside the train. They formed a perfect semicircle around the entrance to his room, like a child had paced there for hours. He crouched, studying them, the hair on his arms rising. The sheriff's voice drifted from behind him. "Don't touch them." He stood slowly and turned. The sheriff looked worse than usual, eyes sunken, beard untrimmed, uniform wrinkled. A man who'd lost a fight in his sleep. Or with his sleep. "You see these before?" he asked. The sheriff scanned the ground with a grim expression. "Seen a lot of things I don't care to explain." "That's not an answer." The sheriff spat into the sand. "That is an answer. Just not one you like." It was becoming the town's favorite way to avoid the truth. He folded his arms. "Who's the child?" "That's the thing," the sheriff murmured. "There ain't no child. Yet there are prints." The sheriff nodded. "That's the problem." Before he could press further, the sheriff pointed toward the horizon. "Look." He turned. The train was smoking. A thin, black plume rose from the third carriage, straight up into the orange sky like a signal flare. "That wasn't there last night," he whispered. "No," the sheriff said. It wasn't. They approached the train slowly, both men cautious, weapons drawn. The ground vibrated faintly under their boots, not enough to be noticeable, but enough to feel wrong. The smoke came from a shattered window on the third carriage. And the smell. Burnt paper. Burnt fabric. And something metallic underneath. "Looks like a fire," the sheriff muttered. He shook his head. "It looks like a message." They climbed into the carriage. Inside, the walls were blackened with soot. Something small had burned on the floor, something that looked like a suitcase, now melted into a puddle of warped metal and fabric. Above it, smeared onto the wall with something dark, were 4 words. "You are too late." The sheriff's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his lantern. "What does that mean?" he asked. He didn't answer. Not because he didn't know. But because the truth was too simple, too cruel. Someone had been here. Recently. And had no intention of hiding it. The sheriff stepped closer to the burned suitcase and poked the ashes with a gloved finger. "Could be the missing witness's belongings," he said. He nodded slowly. "Or someone wants us to believe that." The sheriff eyed him. "You don't think he's dead?" "I think," he said quietly, "that if he were dead, the killer would have left him for someone to find." He stared at the burned message. A warning. A taunt. A signature. "Killers like this," he added, "don't hide their work from an audience." "And who's the audience?" He looked at the sheriff. "We are." They stepped into the second carriage next. The footprints were still there, but now they were accompanied by something else. Handprints. Small ones. Smudged along the walls. Pressed onto the seats. Trailing along the windows. Like a child had walked through the train touching everything they could reach. And each print left a faint residue. Gray. Powdery. Dust-like. He touched one with the tip of his glove. Cold. The sheriff shuddered. "This ain't right." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." As they walked deeper into the carriage, more prints appeared, clustered around a locked door at the far end. The sheriff jiggled the handle. "Stuck." "Move," he said quietly. He knelt, pulled a thin metal tool from his coat, and worked the lock. It clicked open with surprising ease. They pushed the door inward. The air inside was colder. Much colder. A figure sat slumped in the middle of the compartment. A man. Back to them. Shoulders rigid. Head tilted slightly, as if he'd died mid-thought. The missing witness. He knew it before he even stepped closer. The sheriff whispered, "Oh, hell." The man's clothes were coated in that same gray residue. His hair, too. Even his eyelashes were dusted with it. He reached forward and touched the witness's shoulder. It collapsed under his hand. Not like flesh. Like ash. The body dissolved into a pile of gray dust, drifting gently to the floor. The sheriff stumbled backward, horror twisting his face. What happened to him? He swallowed. He wasn't killed, he said. The sheriff stared at the pile that had once been a man. He was. The man's voice cracked. Erased. The sheriff crossed himself. By what? He shook his head slowly. Not what, he said. What implies something we already understand. He looked at the small handprint smeared across the door. This, he whispered, is something else. When they stepped out of the compartment, the sheriff looked 10 years older. So the killer. There is no killer, he interrupted. The sheriff blinked. What the hell does that mean? He leaned against the cold metal wall of the carriage, exhaling shakily. It means, he said, that we've been asking the wrong question. He closed his eyes. In this case, the killer might not be a person. The sheriff stared at him like he'd gone mad. But he wasn't mad. He was terrified. Because whatever left those footprints, whatever touched the walls, whatever stood outside his door, it wasn't flesh and blood. It wasn't human. And worst of all, it wasn't done. Not yet. Chapter 9, The Price of Truth. Night fell again, heavier this time, as if the desert itself was collapsing under the weight of secrets. The wind carried a bitter, metallic tang, the same smell he'd first noticed on the train, the scent of old blood, burnt metal, and something he couldn't name. It clung to his coat, to his gloves, to the sweat on his forehead. He couldn't escape it. And he didn't want to. Not yet. The sheriff followed him back to the settlement, walking in silence. The closer they got to the bar, the more he felt eyes on him, though when he looked, there was no one. Just shadows stretching unnaturally, like the night itself had taken shape. Inside the bar, the air smelled of stale alcohol and old cigarettes. The bartender polished glasses with the same meticulous care he'd shown earlier, but his hands shook slightly. Something in the room had changed. Everyone had changed. He stood at the counter. Someone, or something, is killing people on that train, he said. You saw it, the sheriff replied. Erased them. Dust. Gone. The sheriff's eyes met his. What do you want to do? I want the truth, he said. The sheriff laughed bitterly. Truth? That's a luxury out here. You pay for it. How much? Sometimes more than you're willing to lose. The wind outside rattled the windows, soft but insistent, like a whisper he could almost hear. The words were familiar, chillingly familiar. You are too late. He rubbed his eyes. Maybe it's trying to tell us something. Maybe, the sheriff said. Or maybe it's laughing. He frowned. Laughing. Yes. Death has a sense of humor. You just don't get invited to the joke. He shook his head. People never understood that fear had its own language. That sometimes the point wasn't to survive, but to understand what you were up against. He remembered the first bodies, 5 people on a train with no number, no schedule, no origin. They weren't just dead. They were a message. And now the missing witness. The child's footprints. The hollow man in the locked compartment. The shadowy figure that followed him. All threads tied together into one impossible conclusion: the desert wasn't merely empty. It was a place where truth disappeared. Where life disappeared. Where presence itself could vanish without warning. He wondered if the 5 people on the train had known. If they'd realized that once you stepped onto that corridor of steel, the rules changed. And now, standing in a bar that smelled of smoke and regret, he realized that he was paying the same price. The sheriff spoke again, voice low. Sometimes the truth isn't worth the lives it costs. You see the train, you see the footprints, you see the hollow, there's no coming back. He leaned against the counter, feeling the weight of the desert pressing down. He understood. Truth had a cost. And he had already paid half of it. He looked at the bartender. At the empty tables. At the fading light in the sky. No one leaves this desert unchanged, he whispered. Even if they survive. And at that moment, he realized something worse than death awaited the living. Oblivion. A slow erasure. A life emptied of certainty, memory, and the comforting illusion of safety. He closed his eyes. And heard it again. The wind. A soft, mocking, deliberate hiss. The train is coming. He didn't have to see it to know it was true. Chapter 10, Empty Seat. The desert was quiet. Too quiet. The heat of the day had faded, leaving a chill that pressed against his skin like a warning. The sun had sunk low, painting the dunes in deep orange and shadowed violet. Every step toward the train felt heavier, as if the sand itself resisted his presence. The train was there, waiting. Silent, stationary, unreal. It looked smaller than before, almost fragile, but he knew better. Trains weren't fragile, they just didn't need to obey the rules of the world. He climbed aboard. The interior smelled of burnt metal, dust, and something faintly sweet, like ash mixed with old perfume. Footprints led down the aisle. Bare. Small. Fading. A path left by someone who might never have existed. The seats were empty, but each one seemed to hum with absence, a silent echo of lives once lived and now gone. He walked past the carriages, each step slower, more deliberate. The blackened walls whispered faintly with memory, but no one answered him. Only the wind, or maybe it was the train itself, rattled the windows, a soft sigh that seemed alive. He stopped at the middle carriage. The door, locked the last time, hung slightly ajar. Inside, dust swirled in lazy spirals. He inhaled sharply. Nothing. No hollow body. No footprints. No message. Only emptiness. The only sound was his own heartbeat, loud in his ears. He felt it then, a presence. Not flesh. Not human. Something patient, deliberate, watching. He spun, gun raised. A shadow flickered at the far end of the carriage. Tall. Thin. Silent. And then gone. He exhaled slowly, realizing he'd been holding his breath. Then he noticed the empty seat at the very end, the one nearest the window. Dust-free. Perfectly clean. Waiting. He understood. The seat was never meant to be occupied. Not by the living. Not by the dead. It was a place for the truth to sit quietly, watching those foolish enough to seek it. A reminder that some things aren't meant to be known. He lowered the gun. His hands trembled. Footsteps echoed faintly outside. The desert was returning to its normal rhythm, but he knew it had shifted forever. He stepped back. The train's doors creaked closed on their own. The sun dipped below the horizon. Shadows swallowed the tracks. Somewhere far away, a whistle sounded, not mournful, not warning, just acknowledgement. He turned to the sheriff. "You see it?" he asked. The sheriff didn't answer. He didn't need to. Both knew the same truth, the train, the footprints, the missing witness, none of it could be changed. None of it could be stopped. The desert was empty. But it wasn't forgiving. And sometimes truth vanishes along with those who seek it. He walked away, leaving the train behind. The empty seat waited, patient as ever. He would live. But he would never leave that emptiness behind. The desert swallowed his footprints. The wind carried the silence. And the train waited. The end.